Breaking news tonight. The Supreme Court out with this ruling on the Trump administration and passports. They're now saying that the Trump administration can force people to ID themselves on passports based on their sex at birth, meaning male or female would be the only options. Critics tonight call that a major blow to transgender rights. The court writing in the order that displaying passport holders' sex at birth no more offends equal protection principles than displaying their country of birth. In both cases, they write, the government is merely attesting to a historical fact without subjecting anyone to differential treatment. Let's bring in Laura Jarrett now. And that felt like it is perhaps at the crux of this idea of whether equal protection rights were violated with the Trump administration's moves. What does it mean in practical terms moving forward for example, transgender people, for people looking to identify themselves on their passport?
Yeah, Hallie, this is a super revealing decision for two reasons. One, because, as you say, I think it gives a pretty good window into how the conservative majority...
Okay, so picture this. You're Donald Trump. The Supreme Court is about to issue major rulings that could destroy your presidency, your signature economic policy, your tariffs. They're being challenged. Lower courts have already ruled against you, said your tariffs are illegal, that you misuse emergency powers, and now the Supreme Court is going to decide. And if they rule against you, you'll have to refund billions of dollars in tariffs. Your entire trade policy gets gutted. Your economic legacy is destroyed, but it gets worse. Because even before the Supreme Court rules, you're already losing. Lower courts are striking down your policies across the board. Your food stamp cuts are being blocked. Your emergency powers are being constrained. Your ability to govern is being stripped away by judges. And now, you got one temporary win. The Supreme Court said you can temporarily block food stamp funding while your appeal proceeds. You can withhold $4 billion from 42 million Americans, from families who need food assistance. And you think this is good news, but it's not, because the backlash is immediate and fierce. State leaders are outraged. Democrats are attacking you for taking food from hungry families. Even some Republicans are uncomfortable. And this temporary win might actually hurt you politically more than help you legally, because voters see you withholding food aid. They see 42 million people affected, and they blame you. And all of this is happening right before the Supreme Court issues its major rulings that could destroy your tariffs, that could strike down your use of emergency powers, that could fundamentally constrain your presidency. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Views trans rights more generally, even though this is just on a temporary basis and just as it relates to passports, some of the language there I think is pretty frank and strong and gives a pretty candid view. It's also revealing, though, because it now marks yet another example of how this court has decided to treat the Trump administration's use of executive action, Hallie. Remember, this was something that Trump did in his early moments as he took office for the second time, basically saying there are only two sexes at birth. And so passport's just one of those ways that the Trump administration is now trying to flex its muscle on that, Hallie. Justice Jackson, Hallie, has a blistering dissent here, writing for the liberal wing of the court, and she kind of encapsulates the real-world impact here, Hallie. She says the plaintiffs and the classes of transgender Americans they represent are forced to make a difficult choice that no other Americans face. She says use gender-incongruent passports and risk harassment, bodily invasions on the one hand, or...
And you're terrified. You're publicly calling this life or death for your presidency, warning that if the Supreme Court rules against you, the country will become defenseless. Making apocalyptic predictions about what happens if your policies are struck down because you know you're in trouble. You watched Supreme Court oral arguments. You heard justices, even conservative ones, questioning your lawyers, asking tough questions about whether you exceeded constitutional authority, whether you violated separation of powers, whether your emergency declarations were real emergencies, and your lawyers struggled to answer. They couldn't articulate clear limits on presidential power, couldn't explain why your tariffs were justified, couldn't defend your approach to emergency authorities. And that's a bad sign. When justices are skeptical, when they're asking tough questions, when your lawyers can't give good answers, that means you're probably going to lose. So you're facing a nightmare scenario. Lower courts have already ruled against you. The Supreme Court seems skeptical. Your policies are being struck down. Your presidency is being constrained. And even your temporary wins, like the food stamp stay, are creating political problems. Everything is falling apart at once, and there's nothing you can do to stop it, because the Supreme Court is going to rule, and based on everything that's happened so far, they're probably going to rule against you. This is wild. This is absolutely catastrophic for Trump because he's facing judicial defeats across multiple fronts. His tariffs, his food stamp cuts, his emergency powers, all of it being struck down or seriously questioned. And it's all happening right before the Supreme Court makes final decisions. So let's talk about it. Let's break down what lower courts have ruled, what the Supreme Court arguments revealed, why Trump is calling this life or death, and what happens if the court rules against him. Because trust me, this is Trump's nightmare. This is his presidency being dismantled by courts, and there's no escape. Now, let's start with the tariffs case. This is Trump's biggest concern, his life or death issue. Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on imports from around the world. He claimed emergency powers, said that trade deficits and economic competition were national security threats, and he used emergency authorities to impose tariffs without congressional approval. But lower courts ruled those tariffs are illegal. They found that Trump misused the 1977 Emergency Powers Law, that the law wasn't intended to give presidents unlimited tariff authority, that Trump's justifications didn't meet the legal requirements for emergencies. So lower courts struck down many of Trump's tariffs, said they were unlawful, that Trump exceeded his authority. And now the case is at the Supreme Court. The court heard oral arguments on November 5, 2025, and those arguments didn't go well for Trump. Justices questioned Trump's lawyers for over 2 hours, asked tough questions about limits on presidential power, about whether Trump's actions violated the Constitution, about whether allowing Trump's tariffs would undermine separation of powers, and Trump's lawyers struggled. They argued that presidents need flexibility on trade, that national security requires broad powers, that Congress delegated authority to presidents, but justices pushed back, asked what limits exist on presidential power under Trump's theory, what would prevent future presidents from using emergency powers to take over any area of policy, and Trump's lawyers couldn't give satisfying answers. They essentially admitted that under their theory, presidential power is nearly unlimited on trade matters. As long as a president declares an emergency, they can impose whatever tariffs they want, and justices were troubled by that because it would give presidents power that the Constitution gives to Congress, would allow presidents to circumvent congressional authority over commerce, would undermine the constitutional structure. So based on the oral arguments, Trump is in trouble. Justices seem skeptical of his position. Even conservative justices who might support Trump's policy goals seemed uncomfortable with his legal arguments, and that means Trump is probably going to lose. The court is probably going to rule that Trump's tariffs exceeded his authority, that they're unlawful, and the consequences would be massive. Trump would have to stop collecting tariffs imposed under these authorities. He couldn't impose new tariffs this way. He'd need congressional approval, and Congress might not give it. Companies that paid tariffs would be entitled to refunds. Billions of dollars that were collected under illegal tariffs would have to be returned. That creates huge budgetary problems and economic disruption. Trump's trade policy would be gutted. His signature economic approach, using tariffs aggressively, would be constrained. He couldn't act unilaterally anymore. Trump's entire approach to presidential power would be rejected. The court would be saying that presidents can't use emergency powers as broadly as Trump tried, that constitutional limits matter. That would affect not just tariffs, but other areas where Trump claimed emergency powers. So Trump is right that this case is existential for his presidency, not because the country will become defenseless, as he claims, but because a loss would destroy his policy agenda and his legacy. Now let's talk about the food stamps case. Trump tried to cut SNAP benefits, food assistance for low-income families. He issued new rules restricting eligibility and reducing benefit amounts, but lower courts struck down those rules, said Trump's administration violated federal law, didn't follow proper procedures, exceeded regulatory authority, so courts ordered Trump to restore full SNAP funding. But Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, asked for an emergency stay blocking the lower court order, and the Supreme Court granted it temporarily. The court said Trump doesn't have to restore funding while his appeal proceeds. That affects $4 billion in benefits, 42 million Americans who rely on SNAP. And Trump sees this as a win, as the court supporting him, but it's a Pyrrhic victory because the backlash is fierce. State leaders, especially Democrats, are outraged. They're saying Trump is taking food from hungry families, that he's prioritizing budget cuts over feeding people, that is cruel and unnecessary. Media coverage is negative. Stories about families losing food assistance, about children going hungry, about seniors struggling, all because Trump is withholding benefits. Even some Republicans are uncomfortable. They don't want to be associated with taking food from poor families, especially right before elections. So while Trump got a temporary legal win, he's losing politically, and the Supreme Court stay is just temporary. Eventually, the court will have to decide the case on the merits, and based on the lower court rulings, Trump is likely to lose because the administration violated clear legal requirements, didn't follow procedures, exceeded authority, so Trump will probably eventually have to restore benefits anyway. But in the meantime, he's created a political disaster, showing himself as someone who takes food from hungry families, and that's devastating politically. So yeah, this is the story. Trump getting an early nightmare scenario before Supreme Court rulings drop, lower courts striking down his tariffs and other policies, Supreme Court oral arguments going badly for Trump, Trump facing the prospect of massive judicial defeats that would destroy his presidency, and even his temporary wins creating political problems. Let's break it down. All right, so let's dig into the specific legal issues and why Trump is losing across the board, because this isn't about one case or one policy. This is about courts systematically rejecting Trump's approach to presidential power. Let's start with the tariffs case in detail. Trump's tariff program is based on several legal authorities. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This allows presidents to impose tariffs if imports threaten national security, but is supposed to be used narrowly for genuine national security threats. Trump used it broadly, claimed that steel and aluminum imports threaten national security, that trade deficits are security threats. Courts are saying that's too expansive, that Trump stretched the law beyond its intended purpose. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, this allows presidents to regulate international transactions during national emergencies. But again, it requires genuine emergencies, wars, terrorist attacks, real crises. Trump used it to declare that trade imbalances are emergencies. Courts are saying that's not what the law intended, that economic competition isn't an emergency, justifying these powers. So courts have found Trump exceeded his authority under both statutes, that his justifications don't meet legal requirements, that his tariffs are unlawful. Now, at the Supreme Court oral arguments, justices explored these issues, and several themes emerged. Justices questioned the limits on presidential power. If Trump can declare trade imbalances an emergency and impose tariffs, what else can presidents do? Could they declare any economic condition an emergency and take unilateral action? Where are the boundaries? And Trump's lawyers couldn't articulate clear limits. They argued presidents need flexibility, that courts should defer to presidential judgments about emergencies, but that means essentially unlimited presidential power, and justices were uncomfortable with that. Justices worried about separation of powers. The Constitution gives Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. If presidents can impose tariffs unilaterally by declaring emergencies, what's left of Congress's power? How does separation of powers work if presidents can circumvent Congress this way? And Trump's lawyers didn't have good answers. They argued Congress delegated authority, but justices questioned whether Congress can delegate away its core constitutional powers. Justices considered practical consequences. If Trump's tariffs are struck down, what happens to the billions already collected? How do you unwind years of tariff policy? What about businesses that relied on the tariffs? These practical concerns might make justices hesitant to rule broadly, but they can't ignore constitutional problems just because fixing them is complicated. Justices seem skeptical of Trump's national security claims. Is trade competition really a national security threat? Are trade deficits emergencies? Justices seem doubtful, seem to think Trump was using national security as a pretext to implement trade policy he couldn't get through Congress. So based on these themes, Trump is in trouble. The court seems likely to rule against him, maybe not on all tariffs, maybe they'll draw some distinctions. But Trump will probably lose on the broad use of emergency powers to impose tariffs, and that's devastating for his economic policy. Now let's talk about the food stamps case in detail. Trump's administration issued new rules restricting SNAP. The rules limited who could qualify for benefits, changed how benefits were calculated, reduced the amounts people received, and the administration claimed they had regulatory authority to make these changes. But federal courts found multiple problems with the rules: violation of statutory requirements. The Food Stamp Act sets out specific rules for SNAP. Congress decided how the program should work, and Trump's rules changed fundamental aspects of the program in ways Congress didn't authorize. That's beyond regulatory discretion. Procedural violations. Federal law requires agencies to follow notice and comment rulemaking, publish proposed rules, accept public comments, respond to concerns, provide reasoned explanations for decisions. Trump's administration rushed through rules without proper procedures or didn't adequately respond to comments. Courts found these procedural violations invalidated the rules, arbitrary and capricious decision-making. Administrative law requires agency decisions to be reasoned and supported by evidence. Courts found Trump's administration didn't provide adequate justification for the changes, didn't explain why the changes were necessary, didn't consider alternatives, so the rules were arbitrary and capricious. Based on these findings, lower courts struck down Trump's rules, ordered the administration to restore full SNAP funding, to go back to previous rules, and those orders were legally sound. Trump clearly violated administrative law requirements. So when Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, he faced an uphill battle, but the court granted a temporary stay. Why? Probably because of the administrative disruption argument. Trump's lawyers argued that immediately restoring benefits would cause chaos, that states would struggle to adjust, that it would be administratively difficult. And the court, which often grants temporary stays to preserve the status quo while appeals proceed, granted Trump's request. But that doesn't mean Trump will win on the merits. Temporary stays are about preventing immediate harm while the case is decided. They don't indicate how the court will ultimately rule. And based on the lower court findings, Trump is likely to lose because the legal violations are clear. Trump's administration didn't follow the law, didn't follow procedures, made arbitrary decisions. That's not a close legal question. So eventually, Trump will probably have to restore SNAP benefits. But in the meantime, 42 million Americans are affected. Families are losing food assistance, and that's creating enormous political problems for Trump. Now let's talk about the Portland ruling and other setbacks, because Trump is losing on multiple fronts beyond just tariffs and food stamps. Federal Judge Karen Emergut permanently barred Trump from deploying National Guard troops to Portland. First permanent ban of its kind, shows courts will constrain Trump's use of military force domestically. Other courts have struck down Trump's efforts to redirect military construction funds for border wall, found Trump exceeded his authority, violated appropriations law. Courts have blocked various Trump immigration policies, found they violated due process, exceeded statutory authority, didn't follow proper procedures. Courts have rejected Trump's attempts to end various programs, like DACA, like environmental protections, like healthcare regulations, found Trump's actions were arbitrary and capricious or violated law. So across the board, Trump is losing in court. Judges are striking down his policies, finding he exceeded authority, violated procedures, acted unlawfully, and this pattern is devastating because it shows Trump's entire approach to governance is legally problematic. He tries to act unilaterally, to use executive power broadly, to circumvent Congress and courts, but judges keep saying no, keep finding he exceeded authority, keep blocking his actions. Now let's talk about why Trump is calling this life or death. Because for Trump, these cases really do threaten his presidency in fundamental ways. If tariffs are struck down, Trump's signature economic policy is gone. He's positioned himself as tough on trade, as protecting American workers through tariffs. If courts say those tariffs are illegal, Trump loses his main economic tool, can't point to tariffs as accomplishments, has to admit courts rejected his approach. If his use of emergency powers is rejected, Trump loses his ability to act unilaterally. He's governed largely through executive action, through emergency declarations, through unilateral decisions. If courts say that's not allowed, Trump has to work with Congress, has to get legislation passed, and Congress might not cooperate. So Trump's ability to implement his agenda disappears. If Trump has to refund billions in tariffs, that's a fiscal disaster. Budget problems, economic disruption, businesses getting refunds and adjusting, all creating chaos that gets blamed on Trump. If courts keep striking down Trump's policies, his presidency looks ineffective, he looks weak, unable to accomplish things, constrained by courts. That undermines his political brand as a strong leader who gets things done. So Trump's fear is justified, not in the apocalyptic terms he's using. The country won't become defenseless, but his presidency could become effectively ended, unable to accomplish anything, constrained by courts, defined by judicial defeats. And that's why Trump is so desperate, why he's making life or death statements, why his lawyers are fighting so hard on every front, because Trump knows he's in trouble, knows the courts are closing in, knows his time is running out. Now let's talk about the political implications. Trump's food stamp cuts are politically toxic. Taking food from 42 million Americans right before elections is terrible politics. Democrats are hammering him, running ads about families losing food, blaming Trump for hunger, and it's working. Voters respond to concrete harm. When they see people losing food assistance, they blame whoever caused it, and that's Trump. Trump's tariff troubles undermine his economic message. He's claimed his tariffs are helping American workers, protecting jobs, making America stronger economically. But if courts say the tariffs are illegal, that message falls apart. Trump looks like he was acting illegally all along. Trump's pattern of losing in court makes him look weak. Strong leaders don't lose constantly in court, don't have judges striking down their policies. Trump looks ineffective, unable to govern, constrained, and that's not the image he wants to project. Trump's desperate rhetoric makes him look panicked, calling cases life or death, warning about catastrophe. That's not how confident leaders talk. That's desperation. And voters see it. So politically, Trump is in trouble. The judicial setbacks are creating political problems. And even his wins, like the temporary stay on food stamps, are creating backlash. So yeah, this is where we are. Trump facing a nightmare scenario. Lower courts striking down his policies. Supreme Court arguments going badly. even temporary wins creating political problems, and major rulings about to drop that could destroy Trump's presidency. Let's talk about what happens if Trump loses. Okay, so let's break down what happens if the Supreme Court rules against Trump on tariffs and other issues, because these rulings will have massive consequences. First, let's talk about immediate effects. If tariffs are struck down, Trump has to stop collecting tariffs imposed under the struck down authorities. Immediately, no more tariffs under Section 232 or IEEPA without proper authorization. That's billions of dollars in revenue that stops coming in, creates immediate budget problems. Companies get refund claims. Businesses that pay tariffs under now illegal authorities can demand refunds. The government will have to return money. That's billions of dollars that have to be paid back. Administrative nightmare. Trade policy gets thrown into chaos. Businesses don't know what tariffs apply, what their costs are, what prices to charge. Everything is uncertain until Congress acts. If Congress acts, international relations are affected. Other countries will respond, might demand their own remedies, might renegotiate trade deals, might impose counter tariffs, creates instability in global trade. Trump's economic legacy is destroyed. His signature policy ruled illegal. Everything he claimed as accomplishments on trade gets erased. His entire economic message falls apart. Second, let's talk about effects on presidential power. Courts established that emergency powers have real limits. Presidents can't just declare anything an emergency and act unilaterally. There have to be genuine crises justifying emergency actions, and courts will enforce those limits. Congress's constitutional powers are reaffirmed. The Commerce Clause gives Congress power over international trade. Presidents can't circumvent that just by declaring emergencies. Congress's role matters, and presidents have to respect it. Future presidents are constrained. The president affects not just Trump, but all future presidents. They know emergency powers have limits, that courts will strike down overreach. That affects how presidents govern going forward. Separation of powers is strengthened. The court reaffirms that the constitutional structure matters, that branches have distinct roles, that presidents can't take over functions that belong to Congress. That's good for constitutional government long term. Third, let's talk about political consequences for Trump. He looks like a loser, constantly losing in court, having his policies struck down, unable to govern effectively. That's devastating politically. He loses support from business community. Businesses relied on Trump's tariffs, structured deals around them. Now they're getting thrown into chaos, and they blame Trump for the instability. He faces blame for economic disruption. Whatever economic problems result from striking down tariffs, Trump gets blamed. Because they were his policies, his overreach, his illegal actions. Democrats have powerful ammunition. They can say Trump acted illegally, that courts struck down his policies, that he exceeded his authority, that he can't be trusted with power, and voters might listen. Trump's 2026 prospects deteriorate. With all these legal and political problems, Trump's ability to help Republicans in 2026 is damaged. He might hurt more than help. Fourth, let's talk about what Trump does if he loses. He'll rage publicly, attack the court, claim justices are biased, suggest the system is rigged against him, undermine faith in judiciary. His base will believe him. They'll think Trump is being persecuted, that the courts are corrupt, that the system is illegitimate, and that's dangerous for democracy. He'll try to work around the rulings, find new authorities to impose tariffs, new justifications, new approaches, trying to do what courts said he can't do. He might defy rulings, might continue collecting tariffs, despite courts saying they're illegal, might ignore orders to refund money, creating constitutional crisis. He'll demand Congress act, tell them to pass legislation, authorizing tariffs, putting pressure on Congress to give him what courts said he can't have unilaterally, but Congress might not comply. Democrats will resist. Some Republicans might too, so Trump might not get what he wants. Fifth, let's talk about long-term implications for democracy. Courts prove they can constrain presidents, even powerful presidents who attack them, even presidents who claim unlimited authority. Courts enforce constitutional limits. That's essential for democracy, but it also creates backlash. Trump supporters attack courts, undermine institutional legitimacy, create division over whether judicial review is legitimate. The system is tested. Constitutional crisis is possible if Trump defies rulings. If he continues acting illegally despite court orders, that would force a confrontation about whether law matters, whether courts can enforce their orders, whether presidents are subject to law. But if Trump complies, even grudgingly, that reaffirms rule of law, shows that courts can constrain presidents, that constitutional government survives even stress tests. Sixth, let's talk about immediate next steps. Supreme Court rulings will come down, probably within weeks or months. Trump will have to decide how to respond. Will he comply with rulings or defy them? If he loses on food stamps, benefits will have to be restored. 42 million Americans will see their assistance come back. That's politically necessary. Trump can't indefinitely withhold food from people. If he loses on tariffs, massive changes to trade policy, Trump will have to stop collecting certain tariffs, work with Congress to establish new authorities if possible, deal with refund claims. Trump will continue fighting, more appeals, more legal battles, more attempts to find ways around court rulings. This isn't over, even after Supreme Court rules, but Trump's position gets weaker. Each legal defeat makes the next more likely. Each constraint makes Trump more desperate. So what's the bottom line? Trump is facing a nightmare scenario right before major Supreme Court rulings. Lower courts have already struck down many of his policies. Supreme Court oral arguments went badly. Justices seem skeptical of Trump's legal positions. Trump is likely to lose on tariffs. The court will probably rule he exceeded his authority, that his tariffs are illegal, that would require refunding billions, would gut Trump's trade policy, would destroy his economic legacy. Trump might lose on other issues too. Food stamps, emergency powers, other policies. Courts are systematically rejecting Trump's approach to presidential power. Even Trump's temporary wins create political problems. The stay on food stamp funding affects 42 million people, creates backlash, makes Trump look cruel. Trump is calling this life or death for his presidency. And he's right, not because the country will become defenseless, but because judicial defeats would effectively end his ability to govern, would constrain him so much he can't implement his agenda, would define his presidency as a failure. So Trump is desperately hoping the Supreme Court saves him, hoping conservative justices will bail him out. But based on oral arguments and lower court rulings, that's unlikely. Trump is probably going to lose. Is probably going to see his policies struck down. Is probably going to face the nightmare scenario he's been dreading. And there's nothing he can do to stop it. The Supreme Court will rule, and Trump will have to live with the consequences, whether that's complying with rulings that destroy his agenda or defying them and creating constitutional crisis. Either way, Trump loses. Either way, his presidency is fundamentally damaged. This is Trump's nightmare, and it's already happening. Even before the court rules, Trump is losing, and the final rulings will just confirm what's already clear, that Trump exceeded his authority, that his policies are illegal, that courts can and will constrain presidents who overreach. Stay tuned, because Supreme Court rulings are coming, and they're going to reshape Trump's presidency, going to constrain presidential power, going to reaffirm constitutional limits, and Trump can't stop it, no matter how much he rages, no matter what he threatens. The law is catching up to him, and his nightmare is becoming reality.